Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Hungry for the Word Pod. Today, we're going to talk about paradoxes. And this is one of my favorite things about the kingdom. Um, it is chock full of paradoxes. And the irony, first and foremost, is that a paradox only seems like a paradox from the physical world where there are what we would call extremes, where there is separation between two things. In fact, two immediate paradoxes that come to mind are, water and fire. That how could those be connected, much less how could they be made up of actually the same exact atoms, just put together in a different way and different structure and totally different results from their running wild. Um, but as we were kind of doing some research about what to talk about with paradoxes, I loved what you came up with. And so I'll kind of hand it off to you right away to start us off with one of the, I'll say, most often quoted and alluded to paradoxes that we don't even recognize as a paradox on the surface.
Well, it is the Sermon on the Mount, how Jesus started the Sermon on the Mount. So that's Matthew 5, starting in 3, where he just starts listing the type of people. God blesses those who are poor and realizes their need for him.
Well,
Um,
so do you mind
oh,
reading?
what, oh, I'm in the New Living Translation. I don't know how I got
Oh,
there on that one.
boo.
I've never tried
No,
that
I'm just
one,
kidding.
but
I like all the translations
I do
in different
too.
circumstances.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's all right.
Blessed
I've
are
got it in
the
front of
poor
me.
in spirit. If you want to
Yeah,
go, yeah.
no, please go ahead.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed
Mm,
are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy.
mm,
Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
mm, I love it. And I'll say, side note, I love the way that The Chosen introduces that as a map. And Matthew says, "Why is it a map?" He says, "If anyone wants to find me, they should look in these places to these people." But
Yeah.
I know it's so great.
I love
But
the way Chris describes it as not a to-do list, but a
yes,
description of you.
absolutely. That's a good put a
Yeah.
pin in it. We could maybe do a deep dive
Yeah.
sometimes on, I call it the Beatitudes, you call it the Beatitudes, however you refer to it. It's Matthew 5 through 7. That is a great exercise. Go read that and recognize that this is not a manifesto of things you need to try and live up to in your strength. This is a description of the kingdom, and you're a part of that kingdom. So it's a
Yeah.
description of you. But our focus today being paradoxes, it's the first couple and then the final one to me that are most standing out. Blessed are the poor in spirit. I've met a lot of people who are poor in spirit, and I can tell you that my first word to describe them would not at all be blessed. And yet, the Lord is very, very clear that those are the people. In fact, I think I have it here um, from, that's why. Sorry, everybody. Had to flip. I thought I was on the right page. This is Isaiah verse Isaiah chapter 57 verse 15. For thus says the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose very name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, and also with those who are contrite and humble in spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite. And so the paradox,
Mm.
you are poor in spirit. And in this moment, from your linear comprehension and experience of time, You can't wait to be in a future where it isn't the case, or you're dreaming about the past where it wasn't the case. And he's saying, blessed are you because this is the moment where you and I are closest. This is the
Mhm.
moment where I'm speaking directly into your heart and you're listening with the most perked up ears that you've listened to in the last 10 years of your life, you know? And
Mm.
it's a paradox also because you don't think you're blessed in that moment. And in fact, oftentimes our reaction is anger, frustration, fear, um, resentment, even. And if we could recognize it, Paul was not just giving lip service when he said, I'm in prison and I'm happy about it. And James wasn't saying, you'll come to appreciate the terrible moments because that's when God is closest to you, working hardest for you, when he's most likely to show up in your life. And when the forest fire is raging, it's really hard to believe that the new growth that's going to come from this is better than the growth that had come the last time. He takes you from glory to glory to glory. And so
Mm.
I love that that's what you came up with as far as the paradoxes to start us off, because I know how much I have resented at times being poor in spirit, being poor in physical money, or the last one where he says where you're reviled and persecuted and people attack you and slander you on account of my name. Blessed are you then. Well, I can tell you, I don't feel blessed. My earthly
Mm.
experience does not feel blessed. And yet, heaven and all its host,
Mm.
the Lord himself is rejoicing over you in that moment, the same way that we rejoice reading the stories of the prophets. When Isaiah got slapped across the cheek because he spoke a word to the king, he didn't feel blessed. And yet that made it into the book of life. And I now read it and it gives me courage. Blessed is Isaiah in that moment. And I love it.
I love it. Love it.
The verse that I had come up with for paradoxes, and again, I think I could have spent some time at the beginning. Paradoxes are two seeming opposites that somehow coexist as truth. I think the easiest one that we can think of from a physical standpoint is jumbo shrimp. The irony that we would call a shrimp jumbo is a paradox. I know it's also irony, but I'm just using it for simplicity's sake. So the verse that I came up with is from John chapter 11, verse 3. And this is when Lazarus is sick and dying. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, Lord, he who you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of Man may be glorified through it. And I think about the paradox of, no, actually, that did lead to death. Lazarus physically died at the end of that illness. And again, I don't know who out there has also struggled with illness, deep sickness. I mean, physical maladies, emotional maladies, mental, um, deep depression, any of those things. It doesn't feel like God's glory will be revealed there. It doesn't feel as though the Son of God, you, will be glorified through it. And yet, I think we can take a lot, not only from the recognition that even though Lazarus did die, it was an opportunity for the sisters to recognize that what Jesus said. And now here's another conundrum almost, but a paradox in itself. God is so faithful that he doesn't need you to have faith in him for him to operate. In fact, oftentimes we don't have faith in him and he still shows up on our behalf. And yet, the amount of faith you have is often directly proportional to the magnitude of the glory on the other side of it. And yet, I think more specifically to our experience, the amount of peace and belief that you can have who being steadfast in belief in the Lord, the way that he is steadfast in love toward you, that will directly correspond to how much peace you have as you walk through the journey, the trial, the suffering. And that's a paradox in itself, that how could you have peace in the face of such tremendous suffering? And I want to make an important distinction here. You don't just have peace because sometime in the future it's going to be better. That is a really, really quick way to get frustrated that God does not work on your timeline. I know how many times for me it's been the first of the month, and how many times I'm thinking I got faith because God's going to come through on the 28th, 29th, 30th, or 31st. And you know what? If he comes through on the first, I'll call it okay. And
Mm.
that was me operating on my timeline and thinking God was, my genie, my personal butler for blessings. And what's shifted completely is now that I have faith in the character of God, the timing on earth almost feels irrelevant. And the most recent experience I had of that faith was when you were helping me prepare for a keynote. And it was the night before, and I had no idea how I was going to open it and no idea what a middle third of the content would be. And yet, in the face of like true exasperation, I was frustrated and my mental was frustrated. In our conversation, I recognized, there's a piece that I can't put my finger on that is for no reason at all, that just knows it's going to be okay. And that wasn't like putting myself in the future thinking it'll be okay then. It was
Or
a
after.
true
Yeah.
peace now, exactly, or after. It was a true peace now that I can only attribute to the deepening of my peace connection with him. And I'm just
Mm.
living in the peace that he's living in right now. His work is finished. He is at rest, and that's on offer to us. And I got to experience that for the days and minutes and hours leading up to giving a speech that I had a lot of not peace about.
Mm. Yeah. I wanted to just say about paradoxes, it's kind of back to what we've, this has been a theme for the last couple episodes, but the ego is
Mm,
really unable to live in paradoxes.
yes.
It pulls to this either or the black, black or white.
Yep.
So if you find yourself in a paradox where two seem, it's either this or this, or
Mm-hmm.
um, paradoxes are lived out of the spirit where we're multidimensional and there
Mm,
are multiple truths true at the same time.
absolutely.
So also ego could be like a one. We oftentimes living in ego, we're very one dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you mean dead works? I'm working, I
Uh-huh.
mean, there's no way to get your head around James telling you your faith will lead to works, and uh us being encouraged to repent from dead works.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way that to really resolve that in our head or ego or outside of our spirit.
Yeah, totally.
But those
And
two truths can be true at the same time.
exactly. And that it's a perfect segue, I think, into the I'll say the last point that I have as far as paradoxes go is something else that we've been talking about in the last couple episodes as far as the ego is putting on the new man and putting off the old. And it can be extremely challenging in a moment where, let's just say, for the simplicity of the description, you find yourself in sin. It can be borderline impossible. And in fact, it is impossible to the ego to accept what God has spoken over you in this moment because you are so entrenched, again, sin being separation, you're so entrenched in the separation that your ego refuses to accept that there's a higher truth about you, that you're not like this when you're actively participating in doing this thing.
Hmm.
And that's where I love that the quantum world is chock full of paradoxes. That how is it possible that light can be both wave and particle? How is it possible that as we hone in on telling you the properties of an electron, we can't tell you its location, or vice versa? When we know its location, we can't tell you speed, attributes, anything. Or how is it possible from an entanglement standpoint that Christ is seated on the right hand and I'm in him while I'm right here, right now on earth? I'm saying these words to you. And so I love that you pointed out the ego can't handle that. And so if you're struggling to accept both truths, if you're struggling to be in two places at the same time, that's evidence that, as it was for me for a very long time, my mind was trying to grasp, understand, make sense of it. That I have been so convinced through my own experience that once I understand something, once I comprehend it, then I can operate in it. I can know the rules and so work by them. And part of him inviting us and saying, my ways are higher than your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. That, for although this might, stir the pot a little bit, that used to be true. And while you are still living in and with the ego, it is true. It remains true. The
Mm.
higher truth, if you will, is that you're now one with him. So his thoughts are your thoughts, his ways are your ways. And this is a lovely paradox, in my opinion, to be invited into because I show every single day how my ways are not his ways. And yet, what do I perpetuate forward? Do I notice myself doing that and say, oh, look, here's proof I'm not like you? Here's more evidence that I'm still a broken, faulty sinner. Or, oh my gosh, I just yelled at that other driver. That's not you. And I'm like you. And whatever that word looks like for you, whatever that sort of self talk meditation seems like, I think, as I've said, we go back to the parable in Mark 4 about the way that the kingdom grows. Because in that moment, if I choose to plant the seed that this is how I am, then I'll get what I plant. You will reap what you sow. If I plant that I'm the guy who yells at other drivers, then I'll keep getting that fruit showing up in my life. If I plant in that moment that I'm actually like the Lord and I'm unoffendable, I have endless patience and I don't really care about people and the way they drive, or as I would say, how they don't drive. And when I'm willing to plant those seeds, like we said, can you be patient? Can you take 10 years of planting those seeds and recognize that there's a lot of crops, bamboo being one of my favorite paradoxes? Bamboo, for the first 5 years, rather, the first 4 years, 11 months, and 20 ish days, it doesn't grow at all above ground. And then in the first 6 weeks of its fifth year, they grow about 90 feet. And so if you were to approach someone who has a bamboo farm and you came to them in the fifth year, you'd be like, oh my gosh, bamboo grows so fast. And he's like, you weren't there for the first 5 years, though. You weren't
Mm.
there when I had to water and move things around and de-weed and till the soil and make sure they got sunlight and continue to put mulch on them. You weren't there when I had to work extra hard in the winter months so that the weasels didn't make their way in. These are the things that, as we participate in the kingdom, We are the ones who tend the garden. It's his seed that grows. And if the seed that you're trying to plant is something that needs a really deep, intricate, and strong root system, you just have to accept that that root is growing even while you can't see it. And the paradox is the root growth is so much more important than the above ground growth. It doesn't matter if you shoot up 100 feet if you don't have the root system that will support it. And so, again, that invitation to accept the paradox that you might not see the physical manifestation, you might not have a tangible example in front of you of this truth being true in this immediate moment right now. But if you're willing to accept the paradox, to agree with it, to declare it over your life, it's literally inevitable that at some point you will pick your head up and be standing in a point where that's true right now.
Mm, yeah, true. Reminded me of foundations, houses are the same way. You dig a deep foundation for, the structure you want. And
Yep.
we like to see the fruit in our lives, especially, when we're struggling. So building a foundation is not that exciting.
Right.
But God's not really interested in fixing you up. He wants to replace you with his character and nature.
Mm. Oh
So,
man, that's one of my favorite teaching analogies that I've ever heard is when God first shows up in your life, he'll take you at the pace of your soul. So wherever you are when you're listening to this right now, God knows you better than you know yourself, better than we know you. He will take you at the pace that is best for you to go.
mhm.
But when God first shows up, it feels like all we're doing is tidying up the rooms. And in reality, we're throwing a bunch of stuff out because he's not trying to clean up the house you're in. He's going to build a palace that is worthy of him occupying. And the rugged shack that you have made and called it yourself, no matter how good your tower looks, it's small peas compared to the palace that he's worthy of. And in fact, in I want to say Chronicles is when First Chronicles is when Solomon builds the temple, and in his declaration, his dedication of the temple, he says, "Lord, you the highest heavens can't fit you. How much less this mortal house that I have built." And in that moment, the spirit of the Lord, a cloud of the Lord occupied the temple, and it was so intense and so dense, and the thunder was booming and the lightning was coming out of it, that the priests had to flee, and then no one could physically get into the temple he just built. And so that, from a physical standpoint, to your point, it took him 20 years to build that temple. And after 20 years, it still was only sort of worthy of hosting
Mm,
the Spirit of the Lord. And so when you come to him and recognize that you're inviting him to make his home in you, that he's going to make that home a worthy dwelling place for himself. And a lot of times that looks like doing foundation work that you might not call valuable, but could absolutely not support the type of structure that he's going to put in its place if you didn't do that work. And boy, that if you have a thought, go ahead, because that brings me to one of my favorite verses of all time.
go
Um,
ahead. No.
so this is Isaiah 54, and in one of our earlier episodes, I talked about Isaiah 54, 9 and 10, where he says, "This is like the days of Noah to me. The mountains may depart, hills may be removed, but my steadfast love and my faithfulness won't be departed from you or removed." And right after that, he says, "O afflicted one, storm tossed and not comforted, I am about to set your stones in antimony and lay your foundations with sapphires. I will make your pinnacles of rubies, your gates of jewels, and all your wall of precious stones. All your children shall be taught by the Lord, and great shall be the prosperity of you and your children. In righteousness you shall be established. You shall be far from oppression, and you shall not fear, and far from terror, for it shall not come near you. And that's the house he's building. That doesn't happen overnight. And in fact, if he could make it happen overnight, it'd be like one of those inflatable bounce houses, just as quickly
Hmm.
as it came, is as quickly as it can go. But pinnacles of rubies, gates of jewels, the walls of precious stones. I mean, the foundation is sapphire. It just, it amazes me how often we think that we're being humble when thinking God is worthy and we're not. And here's another paradox, I guess, to, bring it full
Yeah.
circle. He wouldn't have made his home in you. He wouldn't have sent his Holy Spirit. He wouldn't have sent his son if you weren't worthy of his love, of him making his home in you. And so as you agree to walk this out with him, he doesn't insist on his own way, but he will not come occupy a tent. That's part of why the Israelites, as they roamed through the world, the Ark of the Covenant was this beautiful, ornate, gold inlaid, made of the finest wood box that was said to contain his spirit. And it was only worthy of being in that thing, and then that thing inside a tent. And then he builds the temple of Jerusalem. And his cloud is there and he's worthy of it. But now you're the third and final installment. And it's a structure that you can't see with your physical eye. And yet it's more worthy of hosting him than any of the structures he's been hosted in throughout his story. And so I love that reminder that I often don't feel like a worthy dwelling place for him. And yet the paradox is if he said I am, I am. And I am perfect and being perfected. And to be able to accept myself with a sort of non judgment as I go through that process and to continue to die to myself, put off the old man, renew my mind. I am standing more and more in what in eternity is already true. It will be more and more true in the physical space of time that I occupy in that moment, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a good word. That's true.
I love it. All right. Well,
Love
I
it.
think that's a good place to pause for the day. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.